In the high-stakes world of Hollywood, where egos are often larger than the movie posters, Ron Howard has always been the exception to the rule. He is known as the industry's nice guy, a director who arrived on sets with a smile, a baseball cap, and a reputation for being the most patient man in show business. Having grown up in front of the camera as Opie Taylor and Richie Cunningham, Howard understood the vulnerability of actors better than anyone. He believed that a film set should be a sanctuary of creativity, a place where everyone, from the lead star to the craft service worker, felt respected. However, beneath that legendary patience lay a firm set of boundaries. Over the decades, Howard realized that some actors didn't want a sanctuary, they wanted a battlefield. He began to keep a mental tally of the people who pushed him too far, a secret list of stars who, despite their brilliance, would never again be invited to work under his direction. This is the story of how the calmest man in Hollywood learned to say never again, and the 7 individuals who forced his hand. The first name on that list is perhaps the most physically imposing, Russell Crowe. Their partnership began with the highly successful A Beautiful Mind, but by the time they reunited for the 2004 boxing drama Cinderella Man, the dynamic had shifted into something toxic. Howard views directing as a collaborative architecture, a process where everyone follows a blueprint to build something beautiful. But when Russell Crowe walked onto the set, he didn't come as a builder, he came as a general. Crowe was a method actor of the highest intensity, but his method involved challenging every single person in his vicinity. He didn't just want to play the role of the legendary boxer James J. Braddock, he wanted to command the entire production. From the first week, Crowe was nitpicking the lighting, the pacing of the scenes, and even the way the cameras were positioned. He treated the script like a suggestion rather than a guide. The tension reached a boiling point during a grueling sequence in the boxing ring. The air was thick with the smell of old leather and sweat, and the crew was exhausted from hours of repetitive takes. Suddenly, Crowe stopped mid-motion and screamed across the ring at Howard, claiming the director didn't understand the character's internal agony. Howard, usually quick with a calming word, remained perfectly still. His face didn't redden, and he didn't shout back, but his eyes went cold. It was a silence that spoke volumes. The crew felt the shift immediately. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. In private moments with his producers, Howard admitted that directing Crowe was like trying to build a cathedral while riding a wild, bucking bull. He realized that while the final film might be a masterpiece, the cost to his own soul and the morale of his crew was simply too high. When the film was finished, the praise rolled in, but Howard's mind was made up. He never cast Crowe again, choosing peace over the volatile genius that had nearly broken him. If Russell Crowe was a storm of ego, Jim Carrey was a hurricane of pure, unadulterated chaos. In the year 2000, Howard took on the monumental task of bringing How the Grinch Stole Christmas to the big screen. It was intended to be a magical experience for families, but for Howard, it became a descent into a specific kind of hell. The source of the trouble was the physical toll the role took on Jim Carrey. To become the Grinch, Carrey had to endure 8 hours of makeup every single day, having layers of green latex and yak hair glued to his skin. The process was so invasive and uncomfortable that it began to warp Carrey's personality. By the time he reached the set, he was already in a state of high-voltage irritation. He wasn't just playing a grouchy character, he was becoming one. He began to lash out at the makeup artists, the assistants, and eventually Howard himself. During one infamous morning, the frustration boiled over, and Carrey stormed off the set, screaming that he was trapped in a rubber coffin. Howard tried to use his gentle, fatherly approach to soothe the actor, but Carrey was beyond reasoning. He began to sabotage scenes by throwing the script on the floor, changing his lines without warning, and improvising in ways that made it impossible to edit the film together. The production was spiraling so badly that the studio actually hired a Navy SEAL survival expert to work with Carey, teaching him techniques to endure physical torture just so he wouldn't quit the movie. Howard spent every day walking on eggshells, trying to manage a man who had become a green-furred force of nature. By the end of the shoot, Howard looked physically drained in every photograph. While the movie became a massive holiday classic, Howard's private conclusion was swift. He had survived the Grinch, but he would never allow himself to be subjected to that level of madness again. The third name on the list is a man synonymous with Hollywood power, Tom Cruise. It is difficult to imagine the polite Ron Howard clashing with the equally polite Tom Cruise. But during the filming of the 1992 epic Far and Away, two very different philosophies of filmmaking collided. At that time, Cruise was the undisputed king of the box office, fueled by an intensity that bordered on the superhuman. Howard, while younger then, was already a director who prized order, precision, and a certain quiet dignity on his sets. Cruise, however, wanted every single moment of the film to be an explosion of emotion and energy. He was a performer who believed that more was always better. The friction began in Ireland during the filming of a rain-soaked sequence that required a delicate balance of tone. Cruise stopped to take in the middle of a sentence, threw his gloves into the mud, and barked that the scene didn't feel real or visceral enough. Howard, standing in the cold rain with his trademark cap pulled low, didn't move. He looked Crew in the eye and told him that reality isn't always about noise. The silence that followed was legendary. Nicole Kidman, who was married to Cruise at the time and co-starred in the film, tried to act as a peacemaker, but the damage was done. Crew began to overstep, rewriting his own blocking and demanding constant retakes because he felt the energy wasn't high enough. Howard realized that Cruise didn't want a director, he wanted a witness to his own intensity. While they finished the movie professionally, Howard recognized that his style of filmmaking, one rooted in observation and subtlety, could never coexist with Cruise's need for constant loud validation. He never called Cruise for a project again, preferring actors who understood that sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones that are whispered. Mel Gibson represents a different kind of challenge for Howard. In 1996, they teamed up for the thriller Ransom. At the time, Gibson was riding a wave of massive success after winning Oscars for Braveheart. He didn't just arrive on the set of Ransom as an actor, he arrived as a director who happened to be acting. Howard is a filmmaker who meticulously plans every shot, every line, and every movement. Gibson, emboldened by his own directorial success, began to dismantle Howard's plans from the inside. He would question the lighting setups, tell the other actors how to play their roles, and rewrite dialogue on the fly because he claimed it didn't feel right. During one particularly tense exchange, Gibson slammed his script onto a table and told Howard that he knew exactly what the audience wanted and that he was going to give it to them, regardless of what the director had planned. Howard's response was quiet but devastatingly sharp. He told Gibson that he wasn't in the director's chair this time. The air between them turned to ice. For the remainder of the shoot, every scene felt like a duel for authority. Gibson would refuse to do multiple takes, claiming that his first instinct was the only one that mattered, while Howard would secretly record extra footage just to ensure he had what he needed to fix the film in the editing room. The movie was a hit, but Howard later described the project as the most exhausting experience of his life. He decided that he would rather work with less famous actors who respected the hierarchy of the set than with a star who thought his own fame gave him the right to hijack the production. Perhaps the most surreal entry on Howard's list is the legendary Marlon Brando. By the time Howard encountered the icon in the mid-1990s, Brando had become a figure of mythic proportions and mythic difficulty. He had no interest in the traditional rules of the industry. He didn't want to attend rehearsals, he didn't want to follow schedules, and most infamously, he refused to learn his lines.
To accommodate him, Howard's crew had to tape giant cue cards all over the set, on walls, behind furniture, and even on the chests of other actors, so Brando could read them while the cameras were rolling. One afternoon, Brando simply decided the dialogue was garbage and walked off to his trailer, where he stayed for 3 hours while the entire production sat in silence. When he finally returned, he had decided to use a bizarre, unscripted accent that made no sense for the character. Howard, who lived by the clock and the script, felt a level of frustration he had never known. He told his inner circle that it wasn't acting, it was sabotage. The project eventually fell apart, largely due to Brando's refusal to be managed. Howard never spoke of the experience publicly for years, but the trauma of it stayed with him. He realized that even the greatest actor in history wasn't worth the destruction of a production's discipline. He walked away with a new resolve. Genius was no excuse for madness. The sixth name, Hugh Grant, represents a clash not of ego on a set, but of fundamental character. Their fallout didn't happen during a long shoot, but